Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Globe webinar series on the future of global governance. I am Carrie Otterburn of the Lewin Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today, we are joined by Professor Rob Blair for the first episode of our fall season to discuss his book, Peacekeeping, Policing, and the Rule of Law After Civil War, published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. Robert Blair is an assistant professor of political science and international and public affairs at Brown University. His research focuses on international intervention and the consolidation of state authority after civil war, with an emphasis on rule of law and security institutions. He also directs the Democratic Erosion Project, a multi-university consortium that addresses the causes and consequences of democratic deconsolidation through a combination of teaching, research, and civic and policy engagement. He has conducted fieldwork on these and related topics in Colombia, Liberia, Uganda, Cote d'Ivoire, and the US. He has also worked in various capacities for the UN Office Rule of Law and Security Institutions, the US Central Intelligence Agency's Political Instability Task Force, USAID, Freedom House, and the Small Arms Survey. Also joining us today as discussant is Professor Miriam Bradley. Miriam is an associate professor at Institut Barcelona de Estudis Internacionals. Her research examines international responses to conflict, violence, and migration. Miriam's first book, Protecting Civilians in War, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. She is currently finishing a second book on the politics and everyday practice of international humanitarianism, also for Oxford University Press. And maybe one day when that's finished, we'll be able to have a webinar about that book. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Robert of about 25 minutes. Then Miriam will start off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking a few questions, and Rob will have an opportunity to respond. Then we will turn to questions from you, the audience. Feel free to send questions to me throughout the webinar by using the webinar chat box function at the bottom of the webinar window. I will collect your questions to share with the speakers following the presentations. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the GLOBE project. Funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program, GLOBE seeks to understand the constraints and opportunities for the European Union in promoting its interests and values through global governance, with specific attention to 4 key areas: trade and development, security and migration, climate change, and global finance. The 3.5-year project aims to identify the major roadblocks to effective and coherent global governance by multiple stakeholders in a multipolar world, as well as to look ahead to 2030 and 2050 in order to equip policymakers with the tools they need to address future challenges. On behalf of the GLOBE project, I would like to thank Rob and Miriam for joining us today. And now it is my great pleasure to pass the floor to Rob. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, Carrie, for that introduction, and thanks to the GLOBE project for the invitation. As Carrie said, I'm going to be sharing with you some work that I did in my book, Peacekeeping, Policing, and the Rule of Law After Civil War, which was published last year. But then I'm also going to be drawing on a couple of related journal articles, one that was published in the American Political Science Review earlier this year, and one that was published in International Organization back in 2019. So for those of you who just can't get enough of peacekeeping and the rule of law, here's where you can find some more of my work. Okay, so just by way of motivating the talk, the rule of law is quite widely believed to be essential for sustained peace and good governance and economic growth, especially in countries that are recovering from protracted periods of civil war. So Thomas Crothers sort of wryly observed over 20 years ago that one cannot get through a foreign policy debate these days without someone proposing the rule of law as a solution to the world's troubles. And I would say that observation has only become more true in the 20 years since Crothers was writing. The rule of law has been described as a panacea for all the problems that afflict many non-Western countries, and the closest we are likely to approach to a universal secular religion. And yet, for all of the apparent policy importance of the rule of law, we don't know a whole lot about where the rule of law comes from or how the international community might be able to promote it in settings where it is weak or lacking altogether. And that's especially true in post-conflict settings, right? So in countries that are recovering from civil crises, state authorities routinely ignore constitutional constraints on their power and abuse their positions for personal gains. That's happening at the national level. Then at the local level, citizens often quite rightly perceive state authorities to be corrupt and inaccessible. and so they choose to rely on non-state alternatives when they need to seek redress for grievances or have a dispute resolved. So, those would be chiefs or warlords or vigilante groups, authorities that are acting sort of at a meso level between the state and the citizens. Now, these non-state authorities can be cheap and quick and effective, but they can also be biased against historically marginalized groups, and they can be prone to due process violations. So, for example, some might adjudicate crimes through the use of mob justice or trial by ordeal. Now, more than any other institution, either domestic or international, the United Nations has been tasked with trying to resolve these pathologies and establish the rule of law in countries recovering from conflict. So the rule of law promotion is now considered to be a core peacekeeping task, and it is inscribed in the mandates of every single peacekeeping operation that has been deployed since 1999. But is all of this effort paying off? Does UN rule of law promotion actually work? Well, we don't really know. Most analysts, I would say, are quite pessimistic about the prospects for rule of law promotion under third-party tutelage, but the existing evidence is really quite thin and contradictory. So on one side of the ledger, you have those like Michael Doyle and Nick Sambanis, who argue that the UN fosters institutional development and reform, which may in turn be conducive to the rule of law. Or Christoph Zerker, who argues that the UN enhances government effectiveness, which again may be conducive to the rule of law. On the other side of the ledger, you have those like Barnett Rubin, who argues that no, the UN actually crowds out and weakens domestic institutions, leaving them more debilitated than they were before the UN intervened. David Lake argues that the UN tends to legitimize its own missions at the expense of the host governments of the countries where it intervenes. And then Michael Barnett and Christoph Zerker argue that the UN creates only the appearance of change, letting post-conflict countries revert more or less quickly and messily to the status quo that existed prior to UN intervention. Now you'll notice that's the same Christoph Zerker in both columns here, showing that on this issue, like so many issues in political science and international relations, you can comfortably be on both sides of this debate simultaneously. Okay, so in my book and these related articles, I'm going to try to make 4 contributions to this really quite limited literature. First is to help conceptualize the necessary conditions for the rule of law in post-conflict settings and think about what the rule of law even means in countries where the state is really just one of many potential venues for adjudicating disputes. Second is to theorize the role that the international community can play in promoting the rule of law and establishing those necessary conditions for the rule of law, again, focusing in particular on UN peacekeeping operations. Third is to conduct what I believe is the first systematic empirical test of the UN's impact on the rule of law. And to do that, I'm going to combine within country local level evidence from Liberia with cross-country national level evidence from 33 conflict and post-conflict African countries. And then finally, I'm going to try to produce some practical guidance that might be useful for UN personnel in the field. There are a lot of punchlines that come out of this work, but I'm going to focus on 4 for today. So first, I'm going to show you that in Liberia, exposure to peacekeeping increases citizens' reliance on state authorities to resolve the most serious incidents of crime and violence, incidents like murder, where the state claims both original and ultimate jurisdiction. Second, I'm going to show you that peacekeeping also reduces non-state authorities' reliance on extrajudicial punishment, especially trial by ordeal. Then I'm going to zoom out and show you that across African countries, peacekeeping strengthens the rule of law again, but only during periods of peace. When the UN intervenes during periods of ongoing civil war, its effects on the rule of law are null or even negative, whereas during periods of peace, the effects are quite consistently positive. And then finally, I'm going to show you that these effects are driven primarily by the UN's civilian personnel rather than by its uniformed contingents, which is important because the vast majority of research on peacekeeping focuses on those uniformed personnel. We don't pay as much attention to the really critical role that civilians play in peacekeeping operations. Okay. So in terms of the conceptual framework for this project, I would say if you read the political science literature and the legal theory literature as well, you find that the rule of law is typically defined in terms of the actions of state officials and the quality of state laws and institutions, right? Do state officials abide by court rulings? Are the police fair and effective? And in turn, rule of law promotion is typically defined in terms of state reform, right? Can we change the behavior of state officials? Can we change the structure of state institutions? And this is what I describe as an if you build it, they will come approach to rule of law promotion, which implicitly assumes that citizens' demand for state-provided justice and security will sort of trickle down from this renewed supply, right? If we can reform state institutions and change the behavior of state officials, then citizens will just automatically, sort of endogenously seek out the police when they need help solving a crime, or go to the courts when they need help resolving a dispute. I think this approach is misguided. I think there is no reason to assume that citizens will simply acquiesce and comply with and rely on newly reformed state institutions, especially where non-state alternatives exist, right? Where chiefs or warlords or vigilante groups or other non-state authorities are already providing some semblance of security and justice at the local level. Now, these state and non-state authorities can in some cases be symbiotic, but in many cases they are conflictive. Okay, they compete over jurisdictional boundaries, and they compete for citizens' loyalties. And these conflicts between state and non-state authorities can escalate into violence and slow the post-conflict reconstruction process. And if you look around the world, you find lots of examples of this dynamic at work. So warlords in Afghanistan, dozos in Cote d'Ivoire, regulos in Mozambique, clan houses in East Timor, civil patrols in Guatemala, secret societies in Liberia, et cetera, et cetera. Now, one of the key intuitions at the heart of the book and the related articles is that in hybrid legal systems of this sort, in settings where both state and non-state authorities resolve disputes, there needs to be a clear division of legal labor. That's really the key condition for the rule of law. And there needs to be an ultimate arbiter to whom everybody in the system is willing to defer, right? An ultimate arbiter that everybody recognizes and respects. And in most countries, that's going to mean that citizens must rely on state authorities to adjudicate cases that fall unambiguously under state jurisdiction. So even where non-state authorities are authorized to resolve some sorts of petty crimes or nonviolent disputes, the state almost always claims original and ultimate jurisdiction over some classes of cases. Right, so it's very hard to find a country in the world where non-state authorities are legally authorized to adjudicate a case of murder. Right? And it's really important for the rule of law that all actors within the legal system respect the state's ultimate claim in these cases. Second, non-state authorities must not rely on illegal mechanisms of dispute resolution. So even in places where they are authorized to resolve some classes of disputes, they can't do that by using mechanisms like mob justice or trial by ordeal. And then finally, citizens generally must trust state authorities to be reasonably transparent and fair. And really the crux of the argument here is that rule of law is not just about reforming states. It's not just about preparing states to govern citizens. It's also about preparing citizens to be governed by states. Okay, now, my argument about the role that the UN can play is that UN peacekeeping operations can promote the rule of law by acting simultaneously as catalysts for state reform at the national level, surrogates for reform state at the local level, and liaisons between states, citizens, and non-state authorities across these various levels of society. I'm going to explain what exactly I mean by that. So this notion that the UN could catalyze state reform, that the UN could be successful in restructuring police forces, retraining court officials, right, rebuilding prison systems, that has been quite widely theorized, but rarely empirically tested. So in the political science literature on peacekeeping, most studies focus on violence of one sort or another, and most of them focus on the UN's role in resolving commitment problems between armed actors. There really isn't much work on this idea that the UN could catalyze reform of the state. I think the UN's role as a surrogate and a liaison is equally important, but it remains understudied and quite poorly understood. Okay. So just to clarify what exactly I mean by the UN serving as a surrogate and a liaison. So what I'm doing here is I'm drawing on the constructivist literature in international relations, which typically emphasizes the way that international institutions can impel states to change their behavior without resort to the use of physical force. Right, so constructivists talk about the way that international institutions can offer inducements that will alter the incentives of state officials, the way that they can offer education and training to improve the competencies of state representatives, the way they can use persuasion and demonstration effects and norm diffusion to change the beliefs of state officials, and then the way that they can use oversight and monitoring to ensure a greater degree of accountability within state institutions. And Roland Paris quite accurately describes this as a globalization of the very idea of what a state should look like and how it should act. And that fundamentally is what the UN is up to with these peacekeeping operations. It is trying to diffuse a model of the way states should look and behave. And that diffusion is happening from the global north to the global south, and also from sort of rich industrialized countries to countries that are recovering from periods of conflict. Now, constructivists usually describe this as a cross-national phenomenon, right? Diffusion from the global north to the global south. It's happening at the country level. Now, I argue that a similar dynamic occurs within countries as well, and that it often happens through quite mundane, sort of face-to-face, day-to-day interactions between peacekeepers and civilians. And the idea here is that peacekeepers quite literally act out the state. They perform the sorts of functions that states normally perform and provide the sorts of services that states normally provide. And in so doing, they elevate and legitimize the role of the state in the eyes of citizens. They increase reliance on the state over non-state authorities, and they increase reliance on legal over illegal mechanisms of dispute resolution. And if that sounds somewhat abstract, let me just tell you that I'm not making this up. You can actually find these goals written explicitly into the UN's own policies. So three of the primary ways that UN interventions, UN missions intervene at the local level is through patrols, interventions to try to resolve disputes, and public works projects. And each of these operations are designed to try to improve the state's standing in the eyes of citizens. So, for example, the UN in its policy documents writes that patrols are designed in part to extend the geographical reach of the host state and create an environment for the host state to begin reasserting its sovereign authority and reestablishing ties to local communities. Interventions to resolve disputes are designed in part to help create strong positive expectations of host state police, foster popular confidence in the police, and engender legitimacy of the police in the eyes of local populations. And then public works projects, right? A lot of UN missions build roads and bridges and schools and hospitals. And these are designed in part to promote development, but also in part to convey early peace dividends and build the legitimacy and capacity of local authorities. So in each of these ways, the UN, through its interventions, is attempting to legitimize the state in the eyes of local populations. Okay, so I'm going to test this argument using multiple sources of quantitative and qualitative data. And you'll notice because the argument has both a national level component and a local level component, I'm going to need both national level data and also local level data. So to test the effects of peacekeeping at the local level, I'm going to use an original three-wave panel survey that covers 242 rural communities in Liberia and that captures the views of more than 10,000 respondents. I chose Liberia. So Liberia, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a small West African nation still recovering from 14 years of civil war that racked the country from 1989 to 2003. By 2003, the state had completely collapsed and the rule of law had entirely disintegrated. So the UN intervened with a massive peacekeeping operation that was designed in part to prevent civil war recurrence, restore democracy, and also to reestablish the rule of law. In Liberia, you have state and non-state authorities in a state of constant competition with one another. So non-state authorities like chiefs are legally authorized to resolve some sorts of disputes, but they often reject the state's jurisdictional claims. So chiefs often get themselves involved in resolving murder cases or cases of sexual violence, cases that the state claims jurisdiction over. I'm going to combine this original three-wave panel survey with more than 200 interviews with citizens, local leaders, and government and UN personnel. And those are going to help me sort of understand the mechanisms underlying the relationship between UN intervention and the rule of law in Liberia. So that's all at the local level. Then at the national level, I build three new cross-national data sets that cover all conflict and post-conflict African countries since the end of the Cold War. These data sets capture the number of civilian personnel deployed to each UN mission in Africa, the number of personnel assigned specifically to rule of law related tasks, things like police retraining or court reform. And then a data set that captures the extent to which peacekeepers actually engage in rule of law promotion in the field. And there I'm going to draw on the UN Secretary General's progress reports, which describe in quite a bit of detail what peacekeepers actually do on the ground, right? And I want to know not just are they mandated to promote the rule of law, but are they actually doing it, right? Are they actually engaging in activities that might plausibly help restore the rule of law in post-conflict settings? And then I'm going to combine those original data sets with existing providing for peacekeeping data on the number of uniformed personnel deployed to each UN mission as well. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I did in Liberia, and then I'll briefly describe some of my cross-national results as well. So measuring the rule of law is a deceptively simple task. It's quite difficult to measure in a reliable way. So what I decided to do was use this survey to first measure the extent to which citizens rely on state authorities to resolve incidents of crime and violence that fall unambiguously under state jurisdiction. I focus on three types of incidents in particular: murder, ethnic riots, and incidents of mob justice. And these are all cases where the state says, local authorities are not permitted, not legally authorized to intervene to resolve these sorts of cases, right? The state claims both original and ultimate jurisdiction, and I want to know to what extent do citizens respect the state's jurisdictional claim in these serious incidents. I also asked citizens if they perceive state authorities to be corrupt or biased. And then in addition to surveying citizens, I'm going to survey local leaders in each of these communities. And I give them what's called a list experiment, which I'm happy to describe in the Q&A if you'd like, which is designed to measure the prevalence of trial by ordeal. So just to sort of fix ideas here, the way trial by ordeal works in Liberia, there are lots of varieties of trial by ordeal, but to describe sort of one of them, if I live in a village and I'm accused of committing a crime, which I can tell you happens all the time for me. What's called a sassywood man might come and heat a cutlass and put it against my skin. And if my skin burns, I'm deemed to be guilty. And if it doesn't, I'm deemed to be innocent. Now, this practice is illegal under Liberian law, but it is still quite widely used in rural parts of the country. And both the UN and the Liberian government have been really actively involved in trying to eradicate the practice. And I want to know to what extent is the practice being used, and is it being used less in places where the UN has intervened more aggressively? Has the UN succeeded in limiting this practice? Has it succeeded in driving citizens to rely more on the state in these really important capital cases? Has it succeeded in convincing them to perceive state authorities as less corrupt and biased? Okay. Now, I also need to measure exposure to the UN, which is also quite difficult because there's not a lot of data on UN presence at such a low level of aggregation. Right? I need to know where the UN is at the community level. So to do that, I'm going to use this survey of local leaders to measure the frequency of UN patrols, interventions to resolve disputes, and public works projects at the community level. Again, these are sort of the three primary ways that UN missions intervene at the local level. I'm going to combine that with the survey of citizens, which allows me to measure interpersonal interactions between citizens and UNMIL personnel. And then I'm going to combine both of those data sources with administrative data on the locations of UNMIL bases. Those of you who are familiar with the peacekeeping literature know that one of the great challenges in this literature is to try to isolate the causal effect of peacekeeping, to prove that any changes in the amount of violence or the quality of democracy or the quality of the rule of law, to establish that those changes are attributable to peacekeeping and to not to some confounding factor. So I won't dwell on this in any detail, except to say that I triangulate between multiple identification strategies to try to show that the relationships I observe in the data are causal relationships. They're not just correlations. This is the causal effect of peacekeeping on the rule of law. So I'm going to use my qualitative interviews to try to understand the selection process underlying where peacekeepers go, and then use my quantitative data to model that selection process. I'm going to operationalize exposure to peacekeeping at both the community and the individual level. And then I'm going to use two different instrumental variables estimators to try to leverage as if random variation in exposure to peacekeeping in Liberia. And again, I'm happy to talk about those different strategies in the Q&A if you'd like. Okay, so let me show you some of my results. So I'm just going to highlight a handful of results from the Liberia study, and then one set of results from the cross-national work, and then I'll talk about some more of my some other findings that I'm not going to get into in detail. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a plot showing the predicted probability that citizens, or the change in the predicted probability that citizens will rely on state over non-state authorities as a function of the intensity of their exposure to peacekeeping operations. So essentially what I want to know is, in places where the UN engaged in a lot of patrols, are citizens more likely to rely on the state to resolve these really serious cases of crime and violence? Are they less likely to rely on non-state authorities? And indeed, that's exactly what I find. So I find that the more intense the exposure to peacekeeping at the local level, the more citizens rely on state authorities to resolve these serious cases of crime and violence, and the less they rely on non-state authorities. Interestingly, I find that there's really no effect of UN intervention on the likelihood that citizens rely on the UN itself. And that's an important finding as well, because a lot of critics of peacekeeping argue that UN intervention just induces dependence on the international community. Right? The UN intervenes and citizens become reliant on the UN, which in turn weakens the state, delegitimizes the state. And I don't find any evidence of that dynamic at work. Right? It doesn't seem like UN intervention is driving citizens towards the UN. Now, I find a similar pattern when I ask citizens whether they have interacted with UNMIL personnel on an individual basis. Those people who have interacted with UNMIL personnel, they are more likely to rely on formal state institutions to resolve disputes, less likely to rely on informal non-state institutions. Now, in this case, I actually do find some evidence that they are more likely to rely on the UN itself. But if you look at the right-hand side of this plot here, the effect on reliance on the UN is about the same size as the effect on reliance on the state. So to the extent that UN intervention is driving citizens towards the UN, it is doing that at the expense of non-state authorities rather than at the expense of the state. What you're looking at here, so this is a plot where I'm trying to see whether places where the UN has intervened most aggressively are less likely to use a mechanism like trial by ordeal to adjudicate crimes and more likely to rely on the police or to call the UN. And indeed, that's what I find. Right? So I find that in places that have the most intense exposure to UNMIL, local leaders are less likely to rely on trial by ordeal, more likely to call the police or to call UNMIL when something like a burglary happens, for example. Right? So they're less likely to use trial by ordeal to try to divine the identity of the burglar, more likely to simply call the police. Now, again, I find some evidence of increased reliance on UNMIL in addition to increased reliance on the police, but the effects are almost exactly the same. So to the extent that UNMIL is driving citizens towards the UN's own personnel, it's doing that at the expense of non-state authorities rather than at the expense of the state. Okay, just to briefly zoom out here. So what you're looking at here is the relationship between peacekeeping and the rule of law across these 33 conflict and post-conflict African countries. In the top left panel, I'm looking at the relationship between uniformed personnel and the rule of law. And the top right, I'm looking at the relationship between civilian personnel and the rule of law. Bottom left, I'm looking at the relationship between the rule of law and personnel who are assigned specifically to rule of law related tasks. And then finally, in the bottom right panel, I'm looking at the relationship between the rule of law and the extent to which UN personnel are actually engaging in rule of law promotion on the ground. And what I find is that during periods of civil war, so when the UN intervenes while conflict is still ongoing, the relationship between peacekeeping and the rule of law is null or even negative. And it seems like peacekeeping might actually have adverse effects during those periods of conflict. However, during periods of peace, the relationship is consistently positive and really quite strong. But you'll notice also that the relationship is much stronger for civilian personnel than for uniformed personnel. Right? So the marginal effect of an additional civilian deployed to a peacekeeping operation is much larger than the marginal effect of an additional soldier or military observer. Now, those are just a handful of the findings in the book and articles, just to tell you a little bit about the other findings. So I show that UNMIL increased reliance on citizens' reliance on state authorities in Liberia when I use these alternative approaches to try to isolate the causal effects of peacekeeping presence. I show that those effects in Liberia last at least 2 years and possibly longer, even in places that reported no further exposure to UNMIL. Interestingly, I find that UNMIL seems to actually have exacerbated perceptions of state corruption in Liberia, but only in the short term. So these beneficial effects on reliance on the state persist over time, while the adverse effects on perceptions of state corruption actually decay. I find that across countries, the UN's impact on the rule of law is robust to multiple different ways of measuring the rule of law, but that it holds only when the UN engages host governments in the process of reform rather than bypassing them entirely to try to implement rule of law reforms on their own. right, without the involvement of state authorities. Okay, so just to conclude, I show in this body of work that UN missions have positive and potentially lasting effects on the rule of law, even in some of the world's weakest and most war-torn states. Right? I am including in this sample some of the most challenging contexts on the African continent, places like the Congo, places like South Sudan. And I think these findings belie what is the prevailing pessimism about the prospects for state building and rule of law promotion in post-conflict settings, and you find evidence of that pessimism across the academic literature. Right? A lot of folks just simply don't believe that an institution like the UN is equipped to promote the rule of law and to build state authority in countries that are recovering from civil war. And I think that pessimism is really sort of a function of a few different things. One is something that we in the social sciences call selection on the dependent variable, essentially meaning that scholars are focusing on cases of failure, cases where the UN has most obviously faltered, and then using those cases to deduce the impact of peacekeeping across the world. Right? And I think that's a mistake. Right? We need to look both at the cases of success and also at these more isolated failures. The pessimism is also partly a function of a failure to consider relevant counterfactuals. So, for example, in Liberia, critics of the UN in Liberia will often say, well, the Liberian police, they are still pretty corrupt. They are still pretty biased. They are still not all that effective. Therefore, UN intervention must have failed. And I think that's asking the wrong question, right? So the question is not, are the Liberian police a perfectly legitimate, functional institution, right? The answer to that question is almost certainly no. But it's the wrong question. The right question to ask is, would the police have been less functional or less legitimate if the UN had never intervened, right? Are they more legitimate, more functional now because the UN intervened than they would have been otherwise? And I think the answer to that question is almost certainly yes. And finally, I think we have unrealistic expectations about what international intervention can actually accomplish in some of these settings. So this is from a couple decades ago, but in the development community, there used to be this idea that of trying to get to Sweden, right? Trying to transform countries like Liberia into countries like Sweden, right? Rich, industrialized democracies. Now, before I started my PhD, I was training to be a poet, and one of my favorite poets is John Berryman. And there's this wonderful line from one of his famous dream songs where he writes, "Swedes don't exist, Scandinavians in general do not exist. Take it from there." Now, Berryman obviously was not writing about peacekeeping, but I think this is an excellent mantra for international intervention. Right? The goal should not be to transform a country like Liberia and other post-conflict societies into a country like Sweden, right? That is not an achievable goal, and it's probably not a desirable goal either. The goal should be to improve the quality of governance in countries like Liberia in order to improve the quality of life of citizens who live in those settings. And I think that goal is eminently achievable. Again, those of you who are interested in reading more, I encourage you to pick up the book or these two articles, and I'm always happy to hear from folks. There's my email if you'd like to reach out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. This was a really insightful presentation on your book and your key arguments. It was very interesting, and I'm sure the audience agrees. And now we can turn to Miriam to kickstart the Q&A with some of her comments and reflections on the book. So I'm over to you, Miriam.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Rob. First, let me congratulate you on your book, which is a very impressive piece of scholarship, but also on how much material you just... reading the book and in the presentation, I learned a lot about peacekeeping, about Liberia, and as I me some kind of doubt, and almost every time by the end of the chapter you'd addressed it explicitly and resolved the issues, which undoubtedly strengthened your argument, but also makes my task today quite difficult in terms of offering some critiques. So what I want to do is raise one or two niggles that still remain, albeit I don't think they undermine anything hugely, and then ask you to reflect on some issues and cases that go beyond the scope of the book, but which I think, having carried out this research, you're in a good position to discuss. So my first niggle or doubt relates to a conceptual issue, or some conceptual issues, and this is probably the part of the book that I'm most uncomfortable with. So it seems to me that your conceptualization of the rule of law is fundamentally state-centric, in that although you discuss legal pluralism in chapter 3, I don't think you really take it seriously. Or rather, I should say, you take it seriously as an obstacle to be overcome, but not. I don't think you're as agnostic as you want to be in terms of whether state or non-state authorities should have jurisdiction over most issues. So although you claim certain agnosticism there, I don't think you quite follow through on that. And as you were presenting just now, it occurred to me that there's some conflation over the means and methods of administering justice, so trial by ordeal, for example, and the kind of actors. And in reality, bias to some ethnic groups, for example, or mob justice are not only characteristics of non-state authorities, but can also be characteristics of the state. And your rule of law promotion activities, or I should say the UN's rule of law promotion activities, seek to improve the administration of justice by state authorities, but sort of you seem to be assuming that the administration of justice by non-state authorities is necessarily in these trial by ordeal or other forms of justice that we're not happy with. So, for example, you frequently fall unambiguously under state jurisdiction. But if I sort of scrutinize this statement, it seems to me that if you have non-state authorities, I think I might have an audio problem, but I hope you can hear me. If you have non-state authorities contesting the state's jurisdiction, and if citizens are also seeking out non-state authorities to administer justice, then by definition, that incident or case is not unambiguous. It is ambiguous because it's contested. So the only way that I can see of to get around that and to determine to use some other criterion to determine ambiguity or not, which I think from the presentation is the way you're going about it, is, well, if the state claims jurisdiction, the state has jurisdiction. And that to me is not really being agnostic. That's allowing the state to decide, and it's quite a state-centric approach. So that's sort of my biggest critique, and it leads to a few questions. The first, which I think you've answered actually in the presentation, as I just said there, is how do we know when something falls unambiguously within state jurisdiction? Is there some way to identify that without just letting the state decide? Secondly, so if we look at how your conceptualization is expressed, particularly in your hypotheses, you talk about increased reliance on and deference to state authorities. And when I think about that, I start to feel that the rule of law concept, the way you're conceptualizing the rule of law, starts to look a lot like state building. And so I guess I have two questions there. One, conceptual: how do you distinguish your idea of the rule of law from what I would consider to be an overlapping but distinct concept of state building? And secondly, if you accept that your conceptualization is state-centric, then how does that affect the normative desirability of external interveners, such as UN peacekeeping, promoting the rule of law, right? So you, at the very beginning, you talked about the rule of law being or if it would only be universally accepted with a slightly different and less state-centric conceptualization. And so the normative desirability question, I'm thinking especially when we have peacekeepers operating in the midst of civil war, because if you're essentially state building and building up state authorities, trying to get more acceptance for them, you're taking sides in a civil war. So from a normative perspective, how do we stand there? Okay, then I'm going to try and go quickly because I think I'm talking too much and I want to make sure there's time for
others to ask questions. Quickly? Can you maybe try turning off your camera, because we're having a bit of audio issues and it might help a little bit with the sound quality.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so apologies if you didn't hear all of that, but hopefully hopefully you've heard enough to be able to make some comments, and hopefully you can hear me better now. So very short question now on the theory. And again, this is one that you preempted my critique and addressed it, but I just wanted to push a little bit further. So initially, as I was reading your theory, I had the impression that you have these 3 levels of activity, and now I'm going to get them wrong: the liaison, the substitution, or I think you call it surrogate, and the catalyst for reform role. And more or less implicit in your theory is the idea that these function, that they're complementary, that they function together, and they but arguably, and certainly in the humanitarian studies literature, for example, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that substituting for the state, admittedly in slightly different tasks, but substituting for the state undermines the process of building up the state, and especially undermines state-society relations, because it undermines the accountability of the state to society. And you do address this as an alternative explanation, but you particularly look at dependency, and that's a little bit of a different concept from accountability to the population. So I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit and maybe expand a bit your thinking there about the relationship between these 3 different kinds of activities, and if you can even maybe try to identify some conditions under which they are complementary and conditions under which perhaps they could be in tension with each other. And then finally, I wanted to ask you to reflect on some other contexts, so beyond Africa and beyond UN peacekeeping, in fact. The first that jumped to mind, unsurprisingly, is Afghanistan. Not so much a UN mission, but the US and NATO, and perhaps that makes a crucial difference here, but it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Certainly the work that NATO was doing over 20 years or close to 20 years in Afghanistan, much of it fits with the kinds of activities that you're talking about, and obviously the outcome after withdrawal looks like pretty negative, looks like it was pretty ineffective. So I kind of just wonder what your theory or your understanding of rule of law promotion can help, if that can help us understand the Afghanistan context or vice versa. And perhaps also if you could tell us a little bit, because I don't know much about Liberia, I'm guessing lots of people listening don't either, about what's happened. If I'm not mistaken, the UN mission has finished now, and if you could maybe update us a little bit on what's happened since you finished your research. And then I also was thinking a lot as I read the book about criminal violence and Latin America. And I'm wondering if you think your conceptualization of the rule of law is helpful in understanding problems, for example, in Brazil or Mexico or El Salvador. I mean, certainly in those countries, we see a certain level of corruption, extrajudicial killings, and some resort to vigilantes, lynchings, etc. But I suspect that according to your conceptualization, they would do much better than most the African countries you've been studying in terms of the rule of law. And yet in terms of the level of danger, they might be much worse. So if you could just comment there. And finally, I was thinking or wondering about how specific your arguments are to UN peacekeepers, particularly because you find that it's the civilian rather than the military personnel that are having the biggest impact. And I wonder what your thoughts are on whether, so it may be that UN peacekeepers at the moment are the international actors who have the most resources for this kind of intervention. But I wonder whether you think that there are some other international actors who actually might be at least as well placed or better placed than peacekeepers for these kinds of activities. And even whether there could be some advantages of having different actors undertaking each of the three different kinds of roles, the catalyst, the substitute, and the liaison activities, which relates back to my point about whether these are always complementary or sometimes in tension. And I hope you heard enough of that to be able to respond to some of it. And thanks again for the opportunity to read the book and for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for these, I think, challenging but also insightful questions and comments. And I'll turn over to Rob to answer. And Rob, if you wouldn't mind trying to be fairly brief so that we have time for a round of questions from the audience.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Miriam. These are really very insightful questions and comments. I'm so glad you brought up this conceptual issue because it was the issue that I think I struggled with the most in this book, and definitely the one that I think is probably the most controversial. So I think you're absolutely right. This is a state-centric definition of the rule of law, insofar as I claim that the state is the ultimate arbiter of at least some classes of disputes. And you know, the way I was thinking about this was, so you've got a setting where there are lots of different potential authorities to adjudicate a given crime or resolve a given dispute. So what is the rule of law in a setting like that? How do you ensure that different cases are treated in similar ways, right? That it's not just completely idiosyncratic, where you and I may have the exact same complaint, but we're going to get completely different processes and completely different outcomes, which I think is fundamentally anathema to the rule of law. How do you ensure some degree of consistency, some degree of predictability, so that if I have a dispute, right, I can go through a process that I can make sense of, that I can understand to get that dispute resolved? And I think what you observe in places where there isn't a clear delineation of legal labor between the state and non-state authorities is a lot of forum shopping and really sort of a chaos almost at the local level, where, you know, I take my dispute to a chief, let's say, and I don't like the outcome that I get, so then I take the dispute to, you know, an elder, and I like that one better, but the person that I have the dispute with doesn't like that, so they take it to the courts, but then, you know, I don't like the resolution I get in the court, so I take it back to the chief, et cetera, et cetera. And it just means that there's never a stable equilibrium, right? It's hard to achieve a definitive resolution of disputes when citizens can sort of jump from one forum to another. And so I wanted to think of a conceptualization of the rule of law that preserves the role of non-state authorities, right? I don't think that the rule of law requires eradicating them or marginalizing them altogether, which is often what happens in state building projects, right? And there are certainly definitions of the rule of law out there that require suppressing those non-state authorities. And I didn't want to go that far. I don't think that's right. But I do think, and this is where the agnosticism comes in, you know, all states do claim some degree of jurisdiction over some class of disputes. And sometimes that class of disputes is quite small, right? Sometimes the state really only reserves jurisdiction for very serious criminal cases that involve violence. And sometimes the class of disputes is much wider. And I do think, so I'm agnostic as to what exactly the state should and shouldn't claim jurisdiction over. But once it does claim jurisdiction, I think you're right. My argument is people have to respect that jurisdictional claim, because if they don't, then there's simply no way for disputants to predict where their case is going to end up, what kind of resolution and what kind of procedure they're even going to have to go through to get it resolved. So in that sense, I'm definitely, the deck is stacked in favor of the state in some respects here, and that's a bullet I have to bite. That is definitely the approach that I'm taking. But I don't see a viable alternative for the rule of law that doesn't preserve some authority as the ultimate arbiter of disputes. I think without that, it's very hard to have anything that we might want to call the rule of law. You had so many other really great questions. So, and I know I'm supposed to be brief, so I just want to pick up on maybe one, two if I have time, but certainly this one, because I've been thinking about it a lot. What are the implications of this argument and these findings for a case like Afghanistan, for example? So I've really been wrestling with that. Now, at the end of the book, I talk about the distinctions between UN intervention and intervention by countries like the US, actually with Afghanistan quite specifically in mind. And I think there are some key differences here that might help explain why the UN is going to be much more effective at these tasks than an actor like the US. So for one thing, the US caused the war that it was trying to, that it was trying to prevent from recurring. And it caused the collapse of the state that it was trying to rebuild, right? The UN invaded Afghanistan. And this is not to say that the state was, a functional and legitimate before the US intervened. But a lot of Afghan civilians quite rightly blamed the US for the violence that they saw around them. The US also, so when the UN intervenes with a mandate to rebuild the government, there's not a whole lot of ambivalence, I don't think, about that mission, right? It's clear this is what the UN is here to do. The UN is here to try to restore democracy. The UN is here to try to reestablish the rule of law. And the UN itself, right, I think often is quite committed to that goal. Whereas in the US, it was precisely this tension between counterinsurgency and state building, or what we in the US often call nation building. And the US really whipsawed between those goals. So there were periods during the US intervention when we really were focused quite single-mindedly on counterinsurgency, and other periods when we were trying to do state building. And the US population obviously was very torn between those competing goals. And I think there's some, certainly I'm sure not everyone within the UN system always agrees that state building should be the goal, but I think there's much less ambivalence. I think the UN can also plausibly claim to represent the international community in a way that the US can't. And for that reason, I think UN intervention is often quite a bit more legitimate in the eyes of the local population than intervention by an actor like the US. So if you look at polling on perceptions of UNMIL in Liberia, for example, Liberians had very consistently positive perceptions of the UN presence. Right? And they viewed the UN sort of as a representative of the international community, and I think that was important. And then finally, one last point, I think in some respects, what happened in Afghanistan is actually quite consistent with my findings, where I find that when the UN tries to restore the rule of law during periods of civil war, it doesn't work, right? In fact, sometimes it backfires. And Afghanistan, the civil war there has been raging since the UN intervened, right? There really hasn't been a period where we would say, Afghanistan has been at peace. And if you look at, data sets that track civil wars, Afghanistan is in a period of conflict during this entire 20-year span. So in that sense, if you sort of take my findings quite literally, you would expect to observe weak or even adverse effects of international intervention in a setting like Afghanistan during a period of conflict. There's so many other really terrific questions here, and if we have more time, I will get to more of them. But I just want to thank you so much for the careful reading and the constructive criticism. This is really, really terrific.
Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes left, so I have a couple of questions that I'm actually going to combine into one question, if you don't mind, so that we only have one round, basically. The question is, first, regarding the association of exposure to UN peacekeeping and increased reliance on the state, that argument you made earlier in your presentation. How can you determine that the increased exposure to UN peacekeeping is not a side effect, so to speak, of a stronger or more engaged state authority? In other words, how do you know that areas with weaker or more corrupt government structures allow for less engagement by the UN? Or that UN missions are more effective or better able to function in areas that already have better state structures in place? And so this goes along with another question that we received regarding how what you were saying about determining the causal effects through triangulation. And if you could elaborate on that. So I think we can put those two together and hear from you a little bit about how you make these causal determinations.
Great. These are great questions, and it sounds like both of these questions are really getting at the question of isolating causal effects, right? So causal inference in a really tricky setting, right? There's no way to run an experiment where peacekeeping operations, intervene in some countries and not others. So we can't get a clean randomized controlled trial. So essentially, what I try to do here, so to answer the question, for example, about whether the UN is just more successful in cases where the state is already relatively strong. What I find here is both within countries and also across countries, the UN intervenes most aggressively in places where the rule of law is weakest, not in the places where the rule of law is strongest. And what that should do is that should bias my results towards the null effect. Right, so we should find if the UN, if we think that places where the state is relatively strong are going to have relatively better rule of law outcomes, then if the UN is systematically intervening in those places, my estimates should be biased upwards, right? It should look like the UN is more effective than it actually is, but that's the exact opposite of what the UN does. And in fact, this is a pretty consistent finding in the peacekeeping literature. The UN tends to go to the hard cases. It tends to go to the hard cases both cross-nationally and also sub-nationally, right? So even in a place like Liberia, the UN, when you're looking at these really micro-level interventions like patrols or interventions to resolve disputes, it tends to go to places where the risk of conflict is greatest, where the state institutions are weakest, and where the prospects for the rule of law are most grim. And even Liberia as a case is a great example, right? Nobody in 2003 thought Liberia, is going to restore democracy. Liberia is going to reestablish the rule of law. The country looked, it was in terrible shape after that war, and yet, at the end of the UN's mission there, I think most people agree this was at least a qualified success. So that's one way I try to get at this. It's to sort of model that selection process and to show, to the extent that the UN is intervening non-randomly, it's working against me, right? It's working against finding a positive effect on the rule of law. And then I'm also going to use these instrumental variable strategies. So just to give you an example here, in Liberia, in 2012, which was right smack in the middle of my third wave of survey data collection, there was a brutal killing of 7 peacekeepers in a neighboring village in Cote d'Ivoire. And what happened and what I argue in the book is that that killing had nothing to do with anything that was going on the Liberian side of the border. That was all about the Ivorian conflict. But in response to the killing, the UN flooded that border area with additional personnel. And you can see that in the data, right? You can see UNMIL, see on the Ivorian side rushes to the border, but so does UNMIL. Right? And so people who live really close to this Ivorian village on the Liberian side of the border, they're much more likely to get exposed to peacekeeping than people who live further away. And so I can exploit that. Right? I can exploit that tragedy really on the Ivorian side of the border to get as if random variation in the intensity of exposure to peacekeeping on the Liberian side of the border. And I run a bunch of diagnostic tests in the book to try to convince you that this is indeed as if random. And I invite you to check out the book and see if I succeed in convincing you or not. But thank you. That's a really great question.
Thank you very much. That was a great response, I think, and I think inspiring for all of us to pick up the book. But that is unfortunately all the time that we have for today. So I'd like to thank you both, Rob and Miriam, for joining us today, and also our audience members for taking part in this webinar and sending some nice questions. Before leaving you, I would like to just briefly remind you that the Globe webinar series has kicked off in full force this fall and will continue next month with a webinar on the 20th of October, featuring Allison Carnegie and Austin Carson on their new book, Secrets in Global Governance. This gets into transparency. You can register for that webinar at globe-project.eu, where you can see the rest of our recently announced fall and winter lineup, as well as watch all previous episodes of the Globe webinar series. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. From all of us at the Globe Project, thank you and goodbye.